very glad to be part of this panel and share some of my impressions. Well, I've been involved with BIG. We've been looking at the situation from the Finnish-Russian border, but my comments here are a bit more general. And I'm primarily thinking about what I heard at this panel, but also in the panel before, which I arrived a bit late to. And yeah, I think BIG has given us a lot of food for thought about what borders mean and how they are shifting in a very complex and maybe even unnerving situation in the world system. And there's a lot of points that I could raise, and I'm just trying to limit my comments to some of the aspects that I found particularly salient. And I think BIG has produced actually high quality scholarship in many areas of analysis of borders that should be continued. And one of the first things that came to mind is just listening to the talks today, and also resonating with Randy's talk, conceptual change, which I think is one of the best ways to look at any kind of a social-spatial phenomenon, is the conceptual shifts that have taken place, and contextualize them. Whatever happened to the paradigm of the borderless world, which was, I guess, a post-Cold War idea that now the need for borders is basically disappearing because we don't have any real struggle amongst each other. We basically need to just organize economic affairs. We all know that of course was kind of a corporate slogan for greater globalized economic opportunity. But on the other hand, it does resonate. I mean, because we do have, it does make sense. Borderlessness does make sense in an Arctic sense, in an environmental sense, in all those senses where the nation state is basically helpless to do anything because its borders do not matter. So borderlessness has not really disappeared as an idea. But in terms of us down here in our functional worlds, to have a real borderless world, we would need to have an effective global governance, a real effective global governance. And until then, I think borders will remain in flux, and they will mirror shifts in human relations within the world context. So BIG, one of the big takeaways for me is that it shows that borders are actually flexible spaces of adjustment, kind of buffer zones that can be shifted according to changing situations that partly shield national societies from external shocks, but also allow them to adjust to partially open, partially allow flows to come through open borders as situations change. So it's actually kind of a spatial fix. It's kind of a temporary spatial fix that is in constant change. And I think this is quite an interesting way of conceiving borders. I think Emmanuel is quite right. Our kind of fixation on the nation state's borders, they're not going to perhaps disappear that soon. But the fact that fixating on the traditional linearity of that border closes off discussion to the way borders are actually spaces of control, spaces of management, spaces of governance that are taking place above and beyond the national context. BIG started 2013, 12-13. So it's after the big crisis, which, as John Tooze in his book writes, that was the thing that shaped the assumptions underlying globalization. 2008-9, the financial crisis, bang! Globalization all of a sudden became a real ugly word. And I think much of what we're experiencing now in Trump is a result of that big implosion. So this is the post-crisis globalization that we're now thinking of, and how is that factored in? How can we factor that into our conceptual history of thinking about borders? It's just a thing that came to mind. Securitization is one of them. It's always been a border issue. Security, borders are, of course, there to protect societies, whether it be national or defined in other ways. Securitization of people, of things, I think is now becoming a major discussion about borders. And it's also feeding into not just physical security, it's feeding into discussions about identity, belonging, and meaning, making it very complex as well. And we look at border imaginaries of neo-nationalism that are becoming actually powerful political arguments. These rather than border realities. So if you look at Brexit, Trump's wall, or Hungary's civilizational border to protect Christian Europe, these are very strong, I think, narratives of globalization or counter-globalization that are very much using the border as an instrument of political influence and maybe even supremacy of one group over another. So that leads me to, and I don't want to take up too much time, to my final point. And even though it was not mentioned explicitly as part of BIG, but ethical questions, I think, because with the increasing securitization, I think the study of borders is now becoming almost inseparable from questions of the problems that borders mean for local societies and individuals. Also, problems related to xenophobia, exclusion, and inequality. And this is a radical shift away from the idea that national borders express popular sovereignty, political recognition, freedom from externally imposed restraints is something really positive. National border is freedom. Now we'll talk about national borders as being these borders of death, these borders of neo-imperialist inequality. So, ethical questions, and looking at from the border studies viewpoint, or at least my viewpoint, I should be more clear on that. I see at least two ethical considerations that could be elaborated, that partly flow out of the big project. One is this idea that borders are part of critical social construction. So it's part of a systemic, it's part of capitalism, nationalism aligned with global capitalism, and something that is almost like inherent, ingrained in the social relationships on a planetary level. And according to this viewpoint, borders and bordering can be characterized as retrograde phenomena, reflections of highly asymmetric, exploitative power relationships within human societies. And this is a stable motif of critical geography, also steeped in ethical debates, questioning borders insofar as they signify exclusion, reactionary localism, and a false social consciousness. But there is another perspective which you could call ontological pragmatic contingency, which meaning that, borders are not necessarily retrograde or reactionary, walling in of populations, but they're not intrinsically problematic, but they represent a potential resource, an enabling marker of social space and community, a guarantor of ontological security. And they can be something that can enhance the strength of communities and the adaptive capacity of communities and states, rather than be seen as a negative phenomenon. And borders of exclusion are rather the product rather the root cause of political xenophobia. Now, these two viewpoints I just mentioned are not mutually exclusive, and these two positions probably fit together in several ways and complement each other, and that's something that, for me, I find quite interesting. Something that came out of the discussion of the big project, but that was not explicitly mentioned. So, thanks for this opportunity.